Resident Evil 5 Remake is next in line, and Capcom confirmed this by the end of Resident Evil 4 Remake's Separate Ways, teasing us with certain Easter eggs and references to Resident Evil 5.
Soon, the sun will set on the age of man.
If you didn't know by now, Resident Evil 4 Remake was also a way to test some game mechanics that are familiar to the ones we've seen in Resident Evil 5. It looks like Code Veronica fans will just have to wait a bit more longer for that remake. But the bottom line is Resident Evil 5 Remake is next, and no doubt that this has potential to be bigger than Resident Evil 4 Remake. Of course, playing Resident Evil 5 in 2024 feels completely outdated compared to today's standards, but I want to talk about the problems that I have with Resident Evil 5 and how I would fix them for the upcoming remake. Resident Evil 5 was once the best-selling game in the series, and it even revolutionized its gameplay by being the first co-op game in the franchise. This new feature was well received by players and even offered a new, exciting way to play. The Resident Evil franchise was drastically changing, but probably for the worst. It's obvious that Resident Evil 4 was the game changer for the franchise, and it's still the most beloved game in the series. If you're a fan of the more traditional Resident Evil, then this may not be your thing. But if you ask the common gamer which is their favorite Resident Evil game, 4 out of 5 times the answer will most likely be Resident Evil 4. And with the success of the original Resident Evil 4, it was a no-brainer for Capcom to copy and paste its formula into its next sequel. I know RE4 did the same, and as fun as that game is, it felt different from what I was used to in a Resident Evil game. The remake fixed most of the problems that I saw in the original, so I was hoping that Resident Evil 5 Remake would do the same. Now let's start with the obvious one. As much as I enjoyed them during its time, I'm okay with Capcom sticking with the controls of Resident Evil 2 and 4 remakes, because the way they cranked up the action in RE5, we should have had similar controls to Resident Evil 6, which allowed players to move while aiming and shooting for the first time in the series. And to be honest, the original Resident Evil 4 should have been the first to have that privilege, but Capcom said, since RE5 leaned heavily towards action, it just didn't make sense to include tank controls, which just limits your mobility and forces you to take damage. It really shouldn't have been a thing back in 2009, since Dead Space already had this mechanic which released a year before Resident Evil 5. This is obviously going to get fixed in the remake, so let's not waste any more time on tank controls. I'm not a hater of action games. In fact, the Resident Evil series have always been action games, if you think about it. But it's survival horror action, and RE5 is clearly an action game with very few moments of horror, yet alone survival horror. The remake will most likely feel very similar to Resident Evil 4 Remake, but Resident Evil 5 had so much potential to be a great survival horror game, and it even showed whenever it tried to be. But Capcom was feeling experimental during this time and decided to please a new audience. The co-op feature is there, and I always thought that Outbreak was a perfect example on how multiplayer should work in Resident Evil games. I know this is a great departure from the original, and I'll admit that RE5 is an awesome experience when you're playing co-op with a friend, but if there's proof that survival horror never goes out of style, then that proof is Resident Evil 7, the savior of the franchise. Returning to the roots of survival horror is what saved this series, and it's what I believe can help Resident Evil 5 Remake. Aside for the need for more survival horror, what I'd really like to see in RE5 Remake are new enemy types. RE5 has okay enemies, but after seeing some of the content that was removed during its early stage of development, I hope that Capcom resurrects some of them for the remake. Apparently, we were going to have zombies that were very aggressive and would behave similar to the Maginis. We also almost had a Tyrant as an enemy type, but for some reason, Capcom decided to scrap it. If it was up to me, I would have replaced the JJs for the Tyrant. Plus, the JJs are just a copy of this. They were all just straight up clones. I'm also not a big fan of how enemies were able to shoot at you with guns, because it just felt like I was playing a shooter game instead of a Resident Evil game. We can't forget how Resident Evil is also a sci-fi game, so I like it if Resident Evil 5 Remake just sticks with scary and powerful DOWs. Those were the type of enemies that always left a good impression and were definitely the most memorable ones to me. Maybe Ricardo Irvin could transform to a tyrant instead of getting this. Yes, I know this sounds crazy, especially after defending Outbreak, but once you add co-op, the game gets less scary for me. I love the idea of having a multiplayer RE game, but Capcom just doesn't know what to do with it anymore. Believe me, I've had fun playing co-op in Resident Evil 5, but having a partner by your side just takes away the fear and tension that I'm usually accustomed to whenever playing these games. It's wild that RE5 was originally going to be a single player game, with having Sheva as an NPC character who would eventually tag along later in the game. I can't help but wonder what Resident Evil 5 could have been if Capcom would have gone the single player route. If Capcom decides to keep co-op, then at least make it optional, kind of like how Dead Space 3 did it, for the people who want that survival horror experience. This definitely won't sit well with some of you, but I really miss the old saving system in Resident Evil games. I just really like the idea of needing an item to save your progress. It becomes a new challenge in the game. It also adds a new layer of fear that you get without the need of jump scares or any creepy monsters. It's a fear that most Resident Evil fans can relate to, and that's the fear of having to start from your previous save file. That is, if you actually remember to save. The old saving system can be a double-edged sword for players, and not everyone is a fan of this, so the obvious solution would be to make this feature optional, or to include it in harder difficulties like a professional mode or a nightmare mode, you know? That's another reason why I enjoyed Resident Evil 7, since it stuck with the traditional save system, but instead used cassette tapes instead of ink ribbons. This save mechanic really feels like I'm fighting to survive when you have to get to a typewriter in one piece, while being short on health and ammunition. Usually in video games, the player can save their game whenever they please, but this is something that made Resident Evil stand out. There was never an easy way out, everything was just a challenge. Call me crazy, but I really enjoy it, and hopefully that makes a comeback. As great as it was to see Jill back in Resident Evil 5, I wasn't much of a fan of what Capcom did to her. I'm okay with what happens to Jill in Lost in Nightmares, but I didn't like how Jill gets brainwashed by Wesker and turns into a ninja. I literally started laughing when I saw Jill shooting at you from the second floor upside down, which I couldn't take her seriously. I prefer if Capcom went with her original plan that was scrapped from Resident Evil 5. Eventually Chris and Sheva would rescue her from her capsule and wasn't Wesker's minion. Since this is the game that Wesker is supposed to die, then hopefully Jill teams up with Chris and takes him down together, since they have their history that goes back since the first game. I know there's a lot of fans that want to see this, and with the way Capcom has been fixing the remakes, I hope Capcom doesn't miss this opportunity. The thing that threw me off the most about Resident Evil 5 was how it didn't have a merchant. I mean, there is a merchant system where you can sell and buy stuff like you would in Resident Evil 4 and Village, but it's through this inventory screen. I'm shocked that Capcom didn't include an actual merchant after the success of Resident Evil 4. Since Capcom was copying its formula, I'm confused as to why Capcom didn't decide to capitalize on this. My guess is they probably didn't want to copy everything to a T, but I actually enjoy having a merchant who you can chat with after getting swarmed by enemies. Finding the merchant is the same kind of relief that you get when you find a save room in the older games, and the way Resident Evil 4 Remake improved the merchant by adding merchants requests, there's no reason why this shouldn't be an RE5 Remake. And that's about every issue that I have with Resident Evil 5. Do you agree with some of the issues that I mentioned in this video? I'd also like to know your thoughts, and what would you like to see in Resident Evil 5 Remake? Share your thoughts down in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Resident Evil content. Thanks for watching.